So this afternoon we'll do the nervous system real quick. And then we'll go back and review anything else you guys think you need to. I think the nervous system will take us the whole time. Remember that the basic cells and the most basic cells in the nervous system are called neurons. Those are the ones that act like wire and essentially conduct electricity. There's also glial cells, which are like support cells. They help to support the nerves. Let's talk about the parts. Maybe. All right, so there's three main types of nerves that we talked about during the course of class. Motor neurons typically carry information in which direction? To a muscle, away from the brain and spinal cord, away from the central nervous system. Sensory neurons go the other way, from a receptor to the brain or the spinal cord. And an interneuron connects what? It connects two of these together, a motor and a sensory, specifically in what kind of setup? The reflexes, right? The reflex arcs, where the brain gets skipped. Make sure you know the parts of your neuron. The dendrites. Remember, dendra means like a tree. What do? Yeah, so they receive signals, right? Signals that are coming from other nerves or maybe receptors. Then you've got the cell body, which is also called what? Soma. And that's where all your organelles are at, and nucleus and stuff. And then usually there's only one axon coming out. That axon is usually really long and skinny, sort of like a piece of wire. And it's covered with insulation called myelin. Sometimes it's called the myelin sheath. What's that myelin made of? It's fat. It's lipids. Remember that there's little gaps in the myelin coating, like these little places, the little connections in the hot dog chains that you see on cartoons and stuff. That's because those are called the nodes of Ranvier. And then let's talk about the connections. So we have a axon up here. We're going to call this the pre-what? Synaptic neuron, because it's before the synapse. I completely misspelled that. Synaptic neuron. And it is meeting up with another neuron. What part of the next neuron connects up to the axon of the one before it? The dendrite. So this is, so it says that right there, doesn't it? So this is the postsynaptic neuron. And this is the synapse. Remember, it's a gap, but it's a connection. So we got an action potential coming down this neuron. What's an action potential? Yeah, it's electricity, right? But it's caused by the movement of what? Ions, mostly which two? Sodium and potassium. And that's why we call those two ions what name? No, not neurotransmitters. Because they actually make the electricity, we call them electrolytes, right? In Gatorade, electrolytes. So eventually that action potential gets near the end of the axon, and what ion will flood the inside of the axon at that point? Calcium. Ca2+, or +2. And that ion causes what to get pushed out? Neurotransmitters. They get pushed out into the synapse. And you can see them here, these little pink dots down at the bottom. They start to diffuse across the gap. And they'll bind to receptors on the dendrite of the postsynaptic neuron. What kind of receptors are we talking about? Ligand-gated ion channels. Where the ligand in this case is the neurotransmitter, right? And when they bind there, just like always, what pretty much always happens when something binds to a protein? Change shape, conformational change. And in this case, it opens. And that causes what to flood into the postsynaptic neuron? Sodium ions. And that's the beginning of what? That's the beginning of the action potential in the next neuron, the movement of sodiums, because it's generating electricity. So that is kind of how it happens. So this diagram of an action potential is also an important thing to be able to explain. Remember that if we look inside a neuron, this is just a piece of an axon, maybe one of those little nodes. What's usually concentrated on the inside of the axon? Potassium ions. But even though there's lots of potassiums, there's also lots of negative things in here too, right? But the sodiums are kept out here for the most part. And what keeps this separation like this? Yeah, but what makes the gradient? What causes it to be that way? Sodium, potassium pump doing what kind of transport? Active. Even though there's lots of potassiums in here, there's more negatives than positives in here. So the inside has a negative charge, outside has a positive charge. What do we call that when there's a positive side and a negative side to something? Polar. In this case, polarized. So right now the neuron is polarized. And that's the way it needs to be to work. So then a stimulus happens. Sodium start coming in. What starts happening to the voltage inside there, the charge inside there? If sodium starts to come in, it starts to go up. And we can see that charge, that voltage, starts out at like negative 70 millivolts. But as sodium starts to come in after the stimulus happens, it goes up. And the way this process works, as sodiums over here go up, what does that cause to happen like over here? As more and more sodiums come in on this side, what happens to this side of the nerve? It causes the sodium channels over here to open, which means now even more sodium goes in, right? And then the ones on further down, they open. Because what causes them to open? Well, they're said to be what kind of gated? Voltage gated. And eventually, enough sodiums open, enough of the channels open, that the charge gets up to somewhere around positive 40 or so, which is the peak. At that point, what happens to all the sodium channels? They close. This part of the action potential, what do we call it? This side. Depolarization. Because remember, we had negative inside, positive outside. We don't have that anymore, right? Because the sodiums went in. So sodium channels close. And then at this point again, what happens? What else changes? Potassium channels open. And since there's a lot of potassium on the inside and not hardly any on the outside, what do potassiums do? They come out. And what's that type of movement called? A little bit more than that. Because they're ions, they can't just go through the membrane, right? They got to go through a protein. What do we call that kind of movement? Facilitated diffusion. And since positives are leaving the inside of the neuron, that voltage in there starts to drop. What do we call this side of the graph? Repolarization, because it's getting back to negative inside the neuron, positive outside. Remember that it drops a little bit below where it started, a little bit below negative 70. What do we call the period in time when it's below there? It's the refractory period. And during that period of time, the nerve can't work, because what's it trying to get back to the way it needs to be? What's it working to reestablish? The gradient. It's pumping potassiums back in at the same time it's pumping sodiums back out. And eventually it'll do that, and it'll get back to resting. It'll get back to negative 70. And at this point, it's ready to fire again if it needs to, right? That whole thing takes about 5/1000ths of a second. Happens really, really, really fast. Also important to remember that one way that the impulses travel is they tend to jump from one node to the next, to the next, to the next. So that makes the impulse travel how? Faster. And what's the word for that? That the impulse can jump from node to node to node. It's called saltatory conduction. Saltatory because it's the movement of what? Salts, sodium and potassium salts. And that's the reason that neurons that are myelinated can carry impulses much faster than the ones that they can't. All right, while we're here, let's mention a couple of names of some neurotransmitters. What are some names of some neurotransmitters that you've heard of before? Some specific ones. We talked about a couple of them. Serotonin. What's that one important for? Again? Yeah, well, okay. It's not so much a depression medicine, but this is like the happy neurotransmitter. There are parts of your brain called pleasure centers. And if there's a lot of this neurotransmitter being released in those pleasure centers, you feel good. What they found is that people with depression tend to have low levels of serotonin in these pleasure centers. So what do they give you to change that? Well, they might give something like Prozac. Let's go back to our picture for a minute and talk about how that might work. Oops. Okay, I guess I'm going the wrong way. After these neurotransmitters have bound to the receptors and they've done what they're supposed to do, what usually happens to the neurotransmitters? They're either broken down or they're taken back up. Because otherwise, this nerve, the postsynaptic nerve, would keep firing all the time, right? That wouldn't be good. What Prozac does, though, in the pleasure centers, is it causes these neurotransmitters not to be broken down or taken back up, which means they stay in the synapse. And the neurotransmitter that it's causing to stay in the synapse is serotonin. And the places in the brain, at least one of the important places in the brain where that happens, are in the pleasure centers. So what does that mean about your pleasure neurons if you're on Prozac? They're firing all the time, which means what? You're happy, you feel good. Now, the problem with that is that there's also serotonin centers in other parts of the brain. When you take Prozac, is it just going to work in one part of the brain or another? Nope. And what have been some side effects of people taking Prozac? Some have become suicidal, some have started shooting people, killing people. You know, there's been some crazy side effects of those kinds of things. But serotonin is one neurotransmitter. Epinephrine can act as a neurotransmitter in certain parts of your body, adrenaline. No, it's not all hormones. Don't. Dopamine is one. That one's debatable. And then I'll mention one other one. Acetylcholine is an important one. And this is the main neurotransmitter that allows not so much nerves to communicate with other nerves, but what else do some nerves communicate with at a synapse? Nerves are either connected to other nerves or to what else at a synapse? To a muscle. And this is the chemical that allows nerves to tell muscles to contract. But it's still a neurotransmitter. All right, remember reflex arcs. Reflex arcs skip the brain, and what goes on in a reflex arc is you have a sensory neuron that goes to the spinal cord, where it hooks up via an interneuron straight to a motor neuron, and it can make something happen fast. Something you don't have to think about. It's like innate. It's built in, and it lets you react to certain things very quickly. Reflex arcs.
Hey, Dr. Dean.
Yes, sir.
So, like, if reflex arcs don't go through the brain, you can't consciously you're not supposed to be able to consciously control it.
Right.
So, like, how come, I don't know, some people can, like, stick themselves with a pin and, like, not flinch, and then others, like...
Yeah. you may be able to learn to override some of those reflex arcs.
You train yourself to defend. That makes sense.
That would be my guess, is that you are consciously overriding it. And you'd only be able to know that if that would only work if you knew it was coming. But if you knew you were about to get stuck by a pin, you probably could consciously not jerk. That's about the best explanation I have.
Is that like getting a shot?
No, we're just saying if you stuck, you weren't looking and you touch something sharp, you're going to jump back, or you touch something hot, you're going to jump back. He's saying there's some people that can override their reflexes. Anyway, let's talk about the brain here for just a second. I'm not going to say too much about it. This part of the brain right here, what's it called? Cerebellum. Don't confuse that with the cerebrum. Different thing. What's the cerebellum about? It's about coordinating what you see with how you move. Sometimes some people say muscle coordination, but it's like hitting baseball. The cerebellum is real important for that. Catching a ball. Coordinating senses with movements. Cerebellum. Most important part of the human brain is this part, which is the cerebrum, right? And the cerebrum is where most things that make us human happen at. Conscious thought. A lot of parts of memories. A lot of things having to do with emotions. Even like conscious movements. Conscious sensations. Those things all happen in your cerebrum, so it's hugely important. What's this little area right in here called above the pituitary? That's the hypothalamus. And we know the hypothalamus is in charge of what system? Yeah, but what system? Endocrine system, right? System of giving out hormones. And it's all about homeostasis. When you hear hypothalamus, I want you to think homeostasis. And it can keep things at homeostasis either by causing hormones to be released through the endocrine system, but it's also a part of what other system? The nervous, so it can send out nervous impulses also. The pituitary gland makes a lot of hormones. Somebody name me one. ADH, which helps you to conserve water. Name another one. FSH, which causes you ladies to what? Make follicles grow. What are follicles? The eggs and the cells around them. So it makes eggs grow. LH, what does LH cause to happen? Luteinizing hormone. Yep. Causes ovulation to happen. Because remember, once an egg ovulates out of the ovary, what's the left behind part of the follicle called that stays in the ovary? Corpus luteum. That's what's called luteinizing hormone. Human growth hormone gets made in the pituitary. And there's a bunch of other ones. We'll leave it there for right now. This whole part of the brain right here is called what? The brainstem. It's made of the medulla and the pons and some other parts. But mostly it controls what kinds of things? Not motor control. Basic life processes like breathing, heartbeat, things you can't live without. Sometimes it's called what part of the brain? The primitive brain. Because it's not about thought. It's not about emotion. It's about keep you alive kinds of stuff. The brainstem. Also remember that your brain is surrounded by these membranes, which are in light blue up here. They're called the meninges. And occasionally you might get wet. An infection of those, an inflammation of those. And that is very, very, very dangerous. Meningitis.
In smaller animals, their brains, is everything just shrink proportionally, or are they missing something?
They're in different proportions, and that's actually the next thing we're going to look at here in just 1 second. Let's just go ahead and look at it now since you brought it up. All right, so here we have fish brain, top left. reptile brain, top right, mammal brain, bottom right, and an amphibian brain, bottom left. And what you ought to notice with the fish, what do you notice about the fish's cerebrum? It's tiny. It's also very what? In addition to being small, what else is different between ours and theirs? It's smooth, which means there's less what? Less surface area. Fish aren't going to win. They're not going to win a Jeopardy, right? They're not real smart. The biggest part of the fish brain, two of the biggest parts, the cerebellum. Fish have pretty good coordination, and the optic lobe, which means they have some decent eyes, right? They can. I mean, they're in really low light situations, so their eyes have to be pretty good to catch things. They also have a very large olfactory bulb. What's that about? Smell. Fish have a really good sense of smell. Go down to amphibians, which would have come next. Notice the cerebrum's a little bit larger, actually quite a bit larger. Olfactory lobes, still pretty big. Optic lobe is big. It kind of surprises me that the cerebellum of an amphibian is not bigger than it is, because it seems to me like it ought to take a lot of tongue-eye coordination to swat a fly out of the air, right? Seems like that ought to be kind of hard. I can't do that. I don't know about y'all. Cerebellum's kind of small, which is surprising. But still a really smooth cerebrum. Not a lot of surface area. Not a lot of computing power going on there. Even in the reptile, the cerebrum's bigger proportionally than the other parts of the brain, but it's still flat and smooth. Big olfactory bulb for smell. Pretty good cerebellum. Quite a large optic lobe. But in mammals, the thing you ought to see is that the cerebrum is much bigger proportionally than it is to the other parts. It's all convoluted, which gives it even more surface area. Our cerebellum's also pretty enlarged. And some mammals have a pretty big olfactory bulb. Do we? Our sense of smell stinks, right? Yeah. Question is?
So, different types of mammals, is like the size proportionally, or is it still like dependent upon what kind of animal?
It depends on what kind of animal. Our cerebrum is much bigger proportionally than, say, a rat's. I mean, it moves up as you move up the chain of evolution. The cerebrum gets bigger and bigger and bigger proportionally, for the most part. So let's mention a couple other parts of the brain. Let's look at the parts here of the cerebrum for a second. Back in the back of your brain, you have what's called the occipital lobe. And that's where most of the visual information coming into your brain is handled. That's where you interpret visual impulses coming from your eyes. That's why if you get hit in the back of the head, you literally do what? You see stars. So what's causing you to see stars? Your eyes didn't see anything, you got hit in the back of the head. That's why you see stars, you get hit in the back of the head. Neurons are firing back here because they got hit. And your brain doesn't know what it is, so what does it do? It makes up something. Your brain does that a lot. It makes up stuff. You guys ever just seen those tests where they intentionally leave out a lot of words and letters in words, and they give it to you and you read it, and you never even notice that all those things are left out? Because your brain is really good at making things up. And it figures out what it thinks is supposed to be there, and it puts it there. And you don't even realize it's not there. That's kind of what's going on here. Just above or about where your ears are, you have what are called the temporal lobes. And those have several different things in it. They obviously help with auditory information, hearing. Also important, there's a speech area in there that's really important in your temporal lobe. There's also some, I'll come back to that in a minute. Up the top back part of your head, on either side, is what are called the parietal lobes. Those have places for taste, Probably the most important thing in the parietal lobes is they have what's called the somatosensory area. Somato means what? Body. So this is where you sense things from your body. So they actually know, scientists know from doing like open skull test on people when they were conscious, that hey, if you stimulate this part of the brain, people feel it in their hand. If you stimulate this part of the brain, they feel it in the trunk of their body. If you stimulate this part of the brain, they feel it in their leg. So they did this from probably experiments they would get put in jail for today, with people consciously knowing what was going on. Yeah.
Where did they get test subjects?
Good question. I mean, part of it might have been legitimate. Maybe somebody was having brain surgery and they ran these tests. Part of it was learned from like Mengele and stuff like that, and Nazis. Yeah.
Why are humans only species that can talk?
Parrots.
Or like?
I don't think we are. I mean, dolphins have a really elaborate communication system, maybe more elaborate than ours. And the cool thing about dolphins, dolphins sense their world largely through sonar, right? So a dolphin sends out this set of beeps, and it comes off the bottom, and then it reflects back, echoes back, and it hears beep, 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 and its brain knows what beep, 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 beep means. When we want to tell somebody something we saw, we have to tell them, right? We can't show them what we saw. Cool thing about dolphins, they hear beep, 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 beep. Their brain knows what beep, beep, beep says, so then what do they tell their buddy? Beep, 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 the same exact thing. So they can tell them exactly what they sensed. We can't do that. Almost like Morse code. So some people would argue their sense of communication might be better than ours in some ways. Hard to say. I mean, we don't understand what they're doing. Yeah.
So if you have say a headache in a certain area, does that mean that area, or is it just?
Headaches are mostly not about the brain at all. They're about the muscles and the skull, mostly. So it's more head, not brain that's aching. Just in front of this somatosensory area, in the back of the frontal lobe, is what's called the primary motor area. So if you were to stimulate this part of the brain right here, it would make your hand move. So if they had like an electric probe and your brain was open and they shocked this part of the brain, your hand would start to spasm. This part, your leg would start to do something. It depending on where they shocked you, what your leg would do. So you've got the motor area in the parietal lobe, and just in front of that is I said that backwards. The sensory area in the parietal lobe, and just in front of that is the motor lobe, and it's part of the frontal lobe. Also in the frontal lobe, this is where most of your thought processes happen, a lot of memory stuff, and also there's some speech areas in the frontal lobe as well. One more diagram. Okay. What's the pineal gland about? It's back here toward the back of your brain. Yeah, above the cerebellum. It helps control the sleep-wake cycle. And one of the ways it does that is by making what hormone? Melatonin. And remember your sleep-wake cycle, sometimes we might call that what other kind of pattern? Circadian rhythm. It's like a internal clock, a biological clock kind of thing.
So if you take those vitamins that have melatonin in them, that would make you more sleep? Do you sleep more?
Yeah, that's the theory. I don't know how much I buy that, because melatonin, a lot of it at least, when it goes into your stomach, what's going to happen? It's going to be destroyed by your stomach acid. So I don't know how much good that does. I don't have a lot of faith in a lot of these herbal voodoo medicines. We'll see. Yeah.
Okay, so it's natural for people to sleep once a day. So if someone wanted to do that whole day, you sleep for 2 hours or something, that's not normal.
Yeah, that's not the way we seem to be wired. Yeah, I think that could cause some issues. Yeah.
I was reading the other day, like, I think it was like some famous like anthropologist or something, like, or like somebody came up with a theory that like humans are to the